6:01 a.m. The knock was sharp, military sharp, which was ironic. Nora Alden opened the door in a faded robe and bunny slippers, hair in curlers, coffee in hand. 4 HOA enforcers stood outside, armed with clipboards and smug faces. "This is your final notice," barked the one with the sunglasses. "You've violated 5 codes, and the board has decided to evict." Nora blinked, glanced at the forms. Violation of mailbox height. Grass color. The man smirked. "Rules are rules, ma'am." She smiled back, slow and calm. "You brought this to the wrong porch, Corporal." They laughed. But she wasn't joking. Behind them, a golf cart revved loudly like it had something important to say. Nora stepped outside slowly, letting her gaze travel to the driveway where the HOA's official vehicle, a modified cart with hazard stripes and a roof-mounted beacon, was parked on her lawn. The beacon wasn't even spinning. Lazy enforcement. She raised her coffee cup in salute and took a long sip. The clipboard guy stepped forward and waved the papers. "We've given ample notice. You were warned about your hedge dimensions, and the birdbath, and the unauthorized flagpole, and the rogue mailbox, and the lawn shade percentage." Nora didn't flinch. "A rogue mailbox. That's a new one." He nodded, serious. "Non-conforming paint finish. Also your front door. It's teal." "It is. HOA Code 7B says neutral only. Tan. Beige. Eggshelled gray. Not beachside teal. You've had plenty of time to comply." Nora set her coffee cup on the porch railing and glanced to the side of the house. Her flag, an American flag, was flying proudly in the early breeze. The base was steel, regulation height, welded by her late husband before deployment. She thought of the countless mornings they spent adjusting that flag so it didn't tangle in the trees. Her knuckles tightened. "So you're here to evict a 71-year-old widow and her grandkids because my mailbox doesn't match Karen's aesthetic." The man with the clipboard rolled his eyes. The board voted. "It's not personal." At that moment, a sleepy-eyed girl poked her head out the screen door behind Nora. "Grandma, the toaster ate the waffle again." Nora turned briefly. "Use the wooden spoon and smack it on the side." The girl disappeared without question. The enforcer cleared his throat. "Just sign the acknowledgement form, and we can begin your 14-day relocation countdown." Nora raised one eyebrow. "Do I get a complimentary map to my new assigned tent?" They didn't know what to say to that. The woman beside clipboard guy, wearing a purple tracksuit and glittering HOA badge, finally spoke up. "Look, we don't want this to get ugly. Compliance is peace. Resistance is confrontation." Nora nodded thoughtfully. "Then let me be clear. You've just declared confrontation." She walked slowly back inside, calm as a surgeon before an operation, and shut the door with a soft thud. They stood there dumbfounded, expecting her to panic, cry, maybe argue. Instead, the lights inside the house began to flick on one by one. An old radio clicked to life, blasting a vintage military marching cadence. From a second-story window, a parrot squawked. "Get off the lawn, you bureaucratic termite." Then laughter. Actual laughter from inside. The HOA team exchanged glances. One of them muttered, "I told you this lady gave off weird energy." Inside, Nora pulled open a drawer beneath a painting of an aircraft carrier and slid out a leather file pouch. She hadn't touched it in years. But the moment her fingers met the worn leather, it all came back. Her rank. Her battles. The time she stared down a full-blown mutiny with only a mop handle and an iron stare. The time a commanding officer told her she was too old school for naval command. And how she outperformed every single man in his fleet. She opened the pouch and pulled out her old Navy commander insignia, still gleaming. She stepped into her bedroom and began removing curlers. Her reflection in the mirror wasn't the same woman from 10 years ago. But she wasn't weak. She wasn't fragile. And she definitely wasn't about to let 4 HOA Muppets push her off the property her husband died protecting. Downstairs, her grandson was scrolling his tablet. "Hey, Grandma, those same weirdos are on the neighborhood Facebook page, saying you've been cited for sedition." Nora laughed. Sedition. That's adorable. She walked into the kitchen, snatched the spoon from the counter, and whacked the toaster. It surrendered the waffle immediately. Victory. The enforcers, meanwhile, regrouped outside the gate, muttering to themselves. She's bluffing, right? She has to be. No one just walks away from an HOA eviction like that. The clipboard man was starting to sweat. Do we call Karen? Tracksuit lady scoffed. Karen is busy with the garden dedication ceremony. Besides, this is simple. Get the sheriff involved. The property isn't in compliance. End of story. Except it wasn't, because across the street, behind blinds, old neighbors were watching and whispering about how Nora once helped rebuild an entire community garden in a week after a flood, about how she coached local girls' soccer before arthritis caught up, about how her house was paid in full and built by her late husband's bare hands with not 1 cent of HOA money. One by one, phones were picked up, not to call the sheriff, but to call each other. Back inside, Nora sat down with her coffee, pulled out a worn legal folder titled Alden Property Deed and Survey Records, and began flipping through maps. Some of them drawn by hand, others notarized and stamped from decades ago. She tapped one corner of a yellowed paper. Utility easement. Unauthorized trench. Fence overlap. She smiled again. Oh, Karen, you really didn't do your homework, did you? By 7 a.m., the HOA enforcers had driven off. Not because they won, but because Nora didn't give them anything to win. No signature. No compliance. No surrender. They had barked and stomped and threatened, but the old woman in bunny slippers had stared them down like she was back on the deck of the USS Indianapolis. And the worst part, she hadn't even started fighting yet. She would start tomorrow. But tonight she would make waffles. Real ones. With butter and blueberries. Because victory, even small ones, tasted better with syrup. 7:15 a.m. The waffle was warm, the blueberries perfectly melted, and Nora Alden was humming a naval tune as she flipped through the HOA's printed bylaws like it was a romance novel with an ugly ending. Her reading glasses perched on her nose, and a steaming mug of coffee sat beside her, untouched. She wasn't just reading the rules. She was dissecting them, hunting for the rot beneath the shiny HOA seal. One of her grandkids peeked around the corner and whispered, "Grandma's in her battle mode again." Nora didn't even glance up. She was already 2 steps ahead of the board. Across town, HOA President Karen Devereux was standing under a silk canopy at the ribbon cutting of her new garden meditation zone, sipping cucumber water and giving a speech on neighborhood harmony. Dressed in a designer skirt suit and pearls that screamed suburban royalty, Karen smiled for the cameras. Meanwhile, one of her minions texted her mid-speech. Nora Alden refused to sign. Karen didn't even blink. Her response was cold. Get her out. Use Clause 18C. Call the sheriff if needed. This is about control. Back at the house, Nora's wall was turning into a war board. The kitchen now doubled as a command center. Her late husband's topographic maps were spread across the dining table. She'd marked property lines, utility zones, easements, and, most importantly, HOA blind spots. Her cat, Admiral Paws, sat on one of the maps like a paperweight with opinions. Nora reached over him and circled a highlighted line. This. Right here. The HOA's boundary ends 12 feet short of our driveway. The eviction order is illegal from the first sentence. She picked up the phone and called Carl Fincher, her neighbor 3 houses down. Carl had once been sued by the HOA for hosting his son's wedding in the backyard. He answered on the first ring. "Nora, I thought you retired." "I did, Carl." Then the HOA broke into my peace like a raccoon with a grudge. Carl chuckled. "What do you need?" "Your drone. And maybe your old notes on that crazy clause about board member voting procedures." Carl agreed immediately. Retired fireman, now drone hobbyist. He still had a vendetta after Karen made him repaint his mailbox 6 times. We'll have eyes on Karen's house by noon. Later that morning, Nora sat at her desk with a magnifying glass examining HOA Rule 14D. Grass height compliance must be maintained within 1 inch of neighborhood standard. She stood, walked out front, took out a measuring tape, and crouched next to her grass. 3 inches, even. She walked across the street, checked the HOA treasurer's lawn. 4.5. She grinned. Hypocrisy was a dish best served with photographic evidence. At noon, Carl's drone was flying above Karen's backyard. Nora monitored the footage from a small tablet. The footage showed something curious. Karen had an unapproved outbuilding hidden behind hedges, a shed-like structure with electricity running to it. Nora paused the screen. Code 23A. No auxiliary structures over 120 square feet without pre-approval. You outlawed my birdbath but hid a wine cellar. How poetic. She spent the afternoon filing requests for public meeting records, pulling archived photos from neighborhood events, and calling every neighbor who had ever complained about the HOA. One by one, stories rolled in. Fined for wind chimes. Threatened over sidewalk chalk. Cited for a non-neutral curtain visible through a window. But the worst came from her neighbor, Teresa. A single mother fined $500 for placing a mini trampoline in her yard. That trampoline was for my autistic son, Teresa said, near tears. I had to take it down. He cried for a week. That one struck a nerve in Nora like few things ever had. That night, Nora hosted an old-fashioned backyard dinner under string lights. Folding chairs. Lemonade. Crock-pot meatballs. The invitation was simple. Come if you've been bullied by the HOA. She expected maybe 5 people. 23 showed up. Carl arrived with drone footage. Teresa brought a printed record of her fines. An elderly couple came clutching a folder thick with photos of their fence, which they were forced to repaint twice a year. Each person brought a story, a grievance, and something more powerful. Motive. Nora stood at the head of the table. We're not just fighting for our lawns, she said. We're fighting for our dignity. These HOA bullies are counting on our silence. But I didn't spend 20 years commanding sailors only to be pushed around by clipboard tyrants in khakis. I'm not leaving. And neither should any of you. Carl raised his lemonade in a toast. To Nora, our commander in lawn defense. Everyone laughed, but it was more than a joke now. It was a movement. They brainstormed for hours. The retired lawyer offered to draft a petition. Carl agreed to handle surveillance. Teresa would lead outreach to other residents. The elderly couple volunteered to file a joint complaint. It was the beginning of an organized resistance, not a mob, but a legal, well-documented, and calm one. The kind of storm Karen would never see coming until it blew her house of cards to the ground. As the neighbors left, Nora stayed behind and cleaned up the plates, moving slowly but with a smile. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel like she was carrying the weight of the house alone. She looked up at the flagpole, the stars and stripes catching the moonlight, and whispered, "You'd love this, wouldn't you, Frank?" Then she turned back inside, her steps calm and quiet. The storm hadn't started yet. But the winds had changed. And in the world of neighborhood warfare, that was enough to flip the battlefield. By sunrise the next day, Nora Alden had transformed her home from suburban cottage to tactical base. The living room wall had become a full-scale situation map, with string lines stretching between HOA board member houses, their citations, dates of violations, and connections to Karen. Red string meant hypocrisy. Yellow meant money. Blue meant vulnerable. Her cat, Admiral Paws, stared up at it like he expected to find a mouse in the conspiracy. Nora tied the last knot with a sigh. She wasn't just building a defense anymore. This was an offensive operation. She had spent the early hours digging through city zoning documents and tax filings. Hidden in the public archives, she found something delicious. Karen had rezoned her own property 3 years ago to qualify for a state beautification grant, which she had never disclosed to the HOA. Even worse, that meant her position as president was invalid under Article 3F of the HOA bylaws. You had to be a full residential homeowner, not a recipient of active land use variance. Nora chuckled, whispering to herself, "You crowned yourself queen on sand, sweetheart." At 8 a.m. sharp, she slipped into her sensible sneakers and headed out with a folder under one arm. She didn't walk to the grocery store. She walked straight to Garage 6B, where Carl Fincher had set up what was now being lovingly called the resistance bunker. It wasn't much. Just some folding chairs, an old card table, and a giant pot of strong coffee, but for this neighborhood it was ground zero. Inside were 5 of the most recently HOA targeted residents. Teresa sat with a notebook, jotting down dates and names. Mr. and Mrs. Reeves brought cookies, which sat untouched next to a stack of fine notices dating back 3 years. Carl stood by a whiteboard labeled Strategic Offense Ideas. He tapped it with a marker as Nora entered. Operation Overgrow is underway. I've told everyone to stop mowing. Karen hates unkempt lawns more than she hates paying for her own landscaping. He grinned. We give her 50 wild front yards and her blood pressure hits the moon. Nora smiled, setting down her folder. That's petty, Carl. Which I admire. But we need something sharper. I've found her zoning violation. If we get that notarized and circulated, we can challenge her eligibility to even sit on the board. Teresa perked up. If she's off the board, who takes her place? That's the beautiful part, Nora said. We don't appoint anyone. We call a vote, and then we dissolve the board. But first, we expose every conflict of interest she's buried under. They spent the next 2 hours organizing data. Nora had mapped out every instance of board-approved spending in the last 18 months. Carl's drone had photographed Karen's backyard outbuilding again, now with visible power tools and what appeared to be an unapproved water line. That was a code violation, but more importantly, it was leverage. At 10 a.m., they initiated Phase 2. It started with Teresa visiting her old friend who worked at the city permit office. Within an hour, they had confirmed no permits had ever been filed for Karen's outbuilding. At the same time, Carl uploaded drone footage to a private site and sent an anonymous tip to the local city inspector's office. By noon, the neighborhood Facebook page had exploded. Someone, likely Mr. Reeves, who had mastered the art of the passive-aggressive post, shared a blurry screenshot of Karen's outbuilding with the caption, "Interesting structure. I wonder who approved that." Within minutes, comments flooded in. Isn't that a code violation? How many fines has she dodged? Why is my mailbox still under review after 6 months? Karen, sitting in her backyard sipping lemon water, saw the post and nearly dropped her phone. She called a board meeting that afternoon. Emergency session, she declared. All members must attend. Nora, of course, showed up too. Dressed not in her robe this time, but in a crisp navy blue button-up shirt, slacks, and polished shoes. She didn't speak when she entered. She simply sat in the front row, crossed her legs, and smiled like she was watching a school play with an ending she already knew. Karen opened the meeting with false calm. There have been unfortunate rumors about my property. I'd like to state for the record that the structure in question is a temporary gardening shed. Nora raised a hand. Gardening sheds don't have power lines and plumbing. City inspector might be interested in that detail. Karen flinched. Another board member, Dale, coughed awkwardly. Nora, you're not a board member. You're not allowed to speak. Nora stood. You're right. I'm not. But I am a full voting resident. And under HOA Bylaw 12F, any resident may present documented complaints to the board at an open meeting. I have 53. She walked to the front and laid down a thick binder. The room fell silent. She opened the first page. First complaint. Misappropriation of funds. $3,214 from the HOA community budget was used for landscaping at the board president's address on May 3rd. Evidence includes invoice, photographic comparison, and the landscaper's own business card. She flipped the page. Second complaint. Illegally rezoned lot disqualifying Karen DeVarale from holding office under Bylaw 3F. Page 3. Hidden outbuilding with power and plumbing. Code 27C violation. Shall I continue? Karen interrupted, her voice cracking. This is an ambush. Nora calmly replied, no. This is a report. The ambush comes later, if you keep lying. By the time the meeting ended, half the board was pale, one had quietly walked out, and Karen had stopped speaking altogether. Nora didn't smile as she left. She saluted the room, just 2 fingers at her brow, sharp and clean. Then she walked out into the sunlight like she'd just deactivated a bomb. That evening, her house buzzed with quiet excitement. Her grandkids baked cookies for the whole resistance team. Neighbors dropped off pie and hugs and handwritten thank you note. But Nora didn't slow down. She sat at her desk drafting a motion to call a community-wide vote of no confidence. If it passed, the entire HOA board would be stripped of authority. She wasn't just planning to stop the eviction. She was preparing to take down the system that allowed it. And this time, she wouldn't need bunny slippers. She had the law, the people, and the truth. The HOA had no idea what storm was coming next. It was 5:29 p.m. sharp when Nora Alden walked into the Willow Creek Community Hall. The room was filled with the usual tension of any HOA meeting, but tonight, the tension was wrapped in fear. The folding chairs were all occupied. The projector flickered on one end, the smell of lemon-scented air freshener mingled with nerve. Karen stood at the podium, her pearls tight around her neck, and her smile even tighter. This was her territory. Or at least, it used to be. Nora didn't wear her uniform. Not yet. But she stood straighter than anyone in the room. Her blouse was crisp, her binder thick, and her expression unreadable. She took a front-row seat as Karen cleared her throat. Thank you all for attending this emergency HOA board meeting. There have been some, let's say, misunderstandings circulating on social media and around the block. Before we continue with official agenda items, I'd like to personally address these rumors. From the back of the room, someone whispered, "Yeah, like the shed behind your house." Karen faltered for just a second but quickly recovered. There is nothing illegal about my structure. It's a temporary project, fully compliant with our beautification initiative. It's fully within my rights as board president. Nora raised her hand slowly. Karen's eye twitched. We're not taking public comments yet, she snapped. Nora didn't lower her hand. A hush fell. The rest of the board, especially Dale and Martha, who had seen Nora's evidence binder firsthand, looked between them nervously. Nora didn't blink. Dale cleared his throat. Actually, under subsection 7b, any member of the community may speak prior to official motions, provided they have filed a written notice. Which she has. Karen went rigid. Fine. 2 minutes. Nora rose with calm authority. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her presence did the heavy lifting. I stand before you as a resident, a property owner, a grandmother, and a former Navy commander. I came here not to argue over grass height or mailbox paint, but to present evidence of a systematic abuse of power by this board. Specifically, its president. She placed the binder on the podium and opened it. A photo of Karen's illegal outbuilding stared back at the crowd. First exhibit. The structure behind the De Varel residence. Installed without permit. Connected to both electricity and water. The crowd murmured. Karen's smile didn't just fade, it collapsed. Second, she continued, the landscaping at Karen's residence was paid for in part by funds listed under Community Beautification Phase 2. Those funds were approved with no record of a community vote. That's embezzlement. Karen tried to interrupt. This is slander. But Martha, now clearly uncomfortable, mumbled, I didn't approve that invoice. Third, Nora said, flipping another page, Karen rezoned her lot 3 years ago to qualify for a tax grant. According to the HOA's own bylaws, Article 3F, she was disqualified from holding office the moment that went through. Which means every decision she's made since then, every fine, every eviction notice, every board vote she chaired, is invalid. The room went dead silent. Karen's mouth opened, then shut again. Dale stood and whispered something to another board member, who immediately stood and left the room. Martha began fanning herself with a napkin. Before anyone speaks further, Nora continued, I've submitted this binder to the city inspector. The outbuilding will be investigated. The grant fraud has been flagged. And I've filed a formal petition, with 32 co-signers, for a vote of no confidence. Tonight. Karen stepped away from the podium, lips trembling. This is a coup. You're organizing chaos. Nora met her eyes. No. This is accountability. You ruled with clipboards and fines. I prefer facts and fairness. At that exact moment, the back doors opened and in walked 2 men in plain clothes, city code officers. They nodded to the room. Sorry for the interruption, one said. We're here on a report about a code violation at the board president's home. Karen gasped. The timing could not have been better. The crowd buzzed. Someone laughed nervously. Another person clapped. Karen stepped backward, stumbling slightly. This isn't happening. You can't do this. I built this neighborhood. Nora didn't smile. You built a kingdom of fear. And now your subjects are done bowing. The board called a brief recess. When they returned, Dale, looking pale but firm, read a statement. Due to conflict of interest and procedural violations, we are suspending Karen Devereux from her duties pending formal investigation. Furthermore, we will now open the floor to a vote of no confidence. If passed, the board will dissolve and temporary oversight will be granted to a resident-led committee. Nora stepped back to her chair without fanfare. Her work wasn't done, but the ship was turning. They passed out ballots. Anonymous. Fair. Hand-counted in front of the entire room. 43 voted. 39 for dissolution. 3 against. 1 abstained. Karen sat like a statue. No words. No excuses. Just a woman who had finally met someone she couldn't bully. When it was over, Nora rose again, not to gloat, but to lead. I propose we form a temporary neighborhood council. Volunteer-based. Transparent. Let's make the next chapter better than the last. Applause this time. Not loud. But real. That night, as Nora walked home under the soft glow of the streetlights, neighbors waved to her. Some offered hugs. One little girl handed her a drawing of a house with a flag and the words "Thank you, Miss Nora." She tucked the drawing into her bag next to her badge, her binder, and a copy of the bylaws. She wasn't just fighting for her home anymore. She was fighting for all of them. And for the first time in months, she knew they were right behind her. The next morning, Nora Alden awoke to the smell of maple syrup, the laughter of her grandkids, and something else: silence. No clipboards on the porch. No passive-aggressive pink notices fluttering in the wind. For the first time in weeks, there was peace on her property. But she knew better than to celebrate too early. In the military, a retreat didn't always mean surrender. Sometimes it meant they were regrouping. Nora stepped onto her porch with her coffee and scanned the street. A few neighbors were already mowing their lawns. Not because they were forced to, but because they finally wanted to. Someone was painting their mailbox blue. Teresa's trampoline was back up, and her son was bouncing on it like it had never left. Nora smiled. It was working. The stranglehold of the HOA was cracking. But one person hadn't cracked yet. Karen. According to Carl, who still monitored the group chats like a spy with a lawn chair and binoculars, Karen had been holed up in her house since the vote. But she wasn't quiet. Rumor had it she was consulting with a private attorney, threatening lawsuits, and calling in favors with city contacts to reverse the decision. She was claiming political sabotage, a character assassination. She even said Nora had hacked HOA servers, which would have been laughable if she hadn't said it so loudly at the coffee shop downtown. Nora wasn't rattled. She'd seen this before. In the Navy, it was the last gasp of a sinking ship, and she had no plans to toss Karen a lifeline. That afternoon, as Nora reviewed the documents for forming the temporary council, she received a knock at the door. Not the sharp, arrogant kind like before. This was different. When she opened it, she found Sheriff Pete McAllister standing on her steps, holding a large envelope. Pete had served with her late husband. He was a man of few words and strong coffee. He tipped his hat. Got something you're gonna want to see, Nora. It's about Karen. She invited him in, and over black coffee and leftover meatloaf, Pete laid it out. A formal complaint had been filed by Karen against Nora, claiming defamation, disruption of civil order, and hostile takeover of HOA governance. She's using Section 9C of the HOA Charter, Pete explained. It's an old clause. Says any resident who causes substantial operational disruption can be legally removed by force. Nora raised an eyebrow. By force. In theory, yes. Karen's attorney spun it as grounds for emergency eviction. She's trying to claim you're a domestic insurgent. Nora nearly choked on her coffee. A 71-year-old grandma is now a hostile entity. What next? Martial law over the mailbox? Pete didn't laugh. Thing is, Nora, she got the city clerk to process a temporary injunction. She wants me to post it today. I'm not here in uniform because I ain't doing it unless I have to. But the paperwork is valid. For now. Nora took the envelope and opened it. Inside was a notice demanding she vacate her home within 72 hours pending HOA civil litigation. Attached were copies of the very same rulebooks she had used to bring Karen down, now twisted against her. The irony stung. Pete leaned back. I figured you'd want to know before she shows up with cameras or tries to humiliate you again. There's still time to fight it. City Hall won't act fast if we get ahead. Nora didn't hesitate. I need 1 hour. She pulled her grandkids into the living room, explained the situation calmly, and asked them to pack a small overnight bag, just in case. Then she made 3 phone calls. First to Carl. Second to the city inspector's office. Third to the Navy Legal Assistance Office in the next county over. Her old clearance wasn't just sentimental, it still held weight. By 3 p.m., her front lawn was a stage. Not for a protest. Not for a standoff. For evidence. Carl rolled out a projector screen and speakers. Nora printed emails, screenshots, maps, and even copies of the new violation orders issued in Karen's name. And then, she invited every neighbor who had ever been fined, harassed, or threatened by Karen to speak. One by one, they told their stories. A man fined for a swing set. A woman cited for placing a welcome mat that wasn't beige. A veteran threatened for flying 2 flags instead of 1. All documented. All filmed. Nora stood quietly as they spoke, her arms crossed, the envelope still tucked under her elbow. When it was her turn, she didn't speak from anger. She spoke from something deeper. They tried to evict me once because my mailbox was too blue. Now, they're trying again because I stood up for all of you. I'm not scared. Not of her. Not of some twisted clause. I've stood in front of aircraft carriers during live fire. I've led sailors through hurricanes. I've buried friends. And I've raised a family. You think I'm going to fold over a hedge dispute? The crowd erupted in applause. But the real moment came when the city inspector arrived. With 2 assistants and a measuring tool. We received a code violation tip about an unauthorized outbuilding and unpermitted utility connections at this address, he said, pointing at Karen's house. It was as if the entire neighborhood turned its eyes to the corner lot. Karen, standing behind her blinds, watched in horror as the inspectors marched onto her property. Within minutes, they confirmed it. Unauthorized wiring. No permit. A violation not just of HOA codes, but of city ordinances. The sheriff crossed the street calmly, this time with a citation in his hand. By 5:30 p.m., Karen wasn't just facing investigation. She was facing a fine triple the amount of what she'd ever issued to others. Nora returned to her porch, took a deep breath, and finally tore the eviction notice in half. Pete smiled. Consider that notice unposted. The court's going to throw it out anyway after what just happened. Nora nodded. Good. Because I've got a flag to raise tomorrow. And I'm not doing it from a motel. The sun began to set behind the rooftops, casting long shadows across the yards. But for once, the shadows didn't feel ominous. They felt earned. And in the distance, as lights flicked on inside peaceful homes, Nora smiled. One more battle won. And the final one just around the corner. By sunrise, Nora Alden was already outside, the sky just barely blushing over the rooftops. She stood in her yard with a small, folded flag in her hands, the same one her husband had flown every morning before deployment, the one that once flew over the USS Bainbridge during her command tour. Today, it flew again, not just as a symbol of service, but as a quiet declaration of victory. She raised it slowly, letting it snap in the breeze, while her grandkids watched from the porch, still in pajamas, grinning like it was Christmas. Across the street, several neighbors stepped out with coffee mugs in hand. Carl gave her a crisp salute. Teresa waved from behind a line of freshly planted marigolds. The Reeves couple, hand in hand, had already repainted their picket fence, this time in bright sunshine yellow. It was peaceful. Real peace. Not the false kind sold in HOA brochures, the kind you had to earn, one confrontation at a time. But Nora wasn't naive. She knew the war wasn't truly over until the paperwork matched the people's will. The neighborhood still needed leadership. Not from tyrants in pastel blazers with laminated badges, but from the community itself. That's why, by 9 a.m., Nora was back at the folding table in Carl's garage with an open laptop and a legal pad. "All right," she said, tapping her pen. "Let's draft the new charter." The room filled with volunteers. Carl, Teresa, the Reeves. Even a teenager who'd once been cited for skateboarding near the clubhouse showed up, offering to help scan documents. Everyone contributed. Lawn rules were rewritten to favor sustainability, not aesthetic. Community votes were required for any spending over $50. Fines were capped, and more importantly, they had to be justified by 3 neighbors, not just one Karen with a clipboard. By noon, the first draft of the Willow Creek Residents' Council was complete. Nora read it aloud while the group listened with quiet reverence. It was simple. It was fair. It was powerful. And it would never again be weaponized against its own people. But while Nora prepared to hand off leadership to a Democratic committee, Karen had not given up entirely. The former HOA president had spent the last 24 hours desperately calling regional news outlets, hoping someone would spin the story her way. Only one outlet bit, a local station known for slow news days and dramatic taglines. At 2 p.m., a white van pulled up outside Nora's house, and a young reporter stepped out with a cameraman. Nora was pruning her rose bushes. The reporter approached with a practiced smile and a hungry tone. "Ms. Alden, how do you respond to accusations that you've led an unlawful takeover of a legally elected HOA board?" Nora didn't miss a beat. "You mean the board that was violating its own charter, abusing its residents, and embezzling landscaping funds? That board?" The reporter blinked. "There are claims of extremism, military intimidation, organized surveillance, and coercion. You're welcome to speak to any neighbor here," Nora said, turning back to her rosebush. "But I didn't intimidate anyone. I educated them. And the only thing I coerced was truth." The camera panned to the newly posted community board, where neighbors had pinned notes of gratitude and suggestions for weekend picnic. Behind them, a little boy was laughing on his trampoline. A dog barked happily. It was the least threatening rebellion the town had ever seen. As the news crew wrapped up, the cameraman pulled Nora aside. "For what it's worth, ma'am, my mom was in the Navy. You remind me of her. No nonsense, but all heart." Nora smiled softly. "Tell her thank you for her service." That night, as twilight fell over Willow Creek, the neighborhood came alive in a way it hadn't in years. Not with fireworks or loud music, but with lanterns, lawn chairs, and the smell of grilled corn. A community potluck bloomed across the park greenbelt. Children ran barefoot between lawn games, and grandmothers swapped recipes beside crockpots. Nora arrived last, wearing a simple navy cardigan and holding a tray of homemade peach cobbler. As she walked in, applause broke out, not wild or rehearsed, just honest. Teresa stepped forward and handed her a folded piece of paper. "You were unanimously voted interim chair of the new council." We want you to finish what you started. Nora took the paper, read the names, and felt something rare swell in her chest. It wasn't pride. It was trust. She stood on the edge of the makeshift gathering and addressed the crowd. You all know I didn't do this alone. It took every one of us standing up, not just to bullies, but to our own fear of rocking the boat. But here's the thing, boats are meant to move, not stay anchored in control. From now on, this neighborhood moves together. Cheers followed. Someone popped open a soda too hard, and foam sprayed everywhere. Laughter exploded. A toddler danced in the mess. Nora sat down next to Carl, who was eating macaroni salad straight from the bowl. You think it'll last? He asked between bites. Nora watched her grandkids racing a dog down the hill. That depends. Are we done fighting each other? Carl nodded. For now. Then yes, she said. It'll last. Just before she went home, Nora stopped by her mailbox, the one they tried to find her over. She had painted it back to teal, but this time added a small plaque on the side. It read simply, Property of Nora Alden, Commander, U.S. Navy, retired, and proud resident of Willow Creek. She touched it once, like sealing a mission complete. No fanfare, no press. Just a quiet woman who stood her ground and reminded an entire neighborhood what leadership really looked like. And somewhere across town, in a quiet office, Karen received the final blow, a letter from the city informing her that her zoning violations and permit fraud had voided her board eligibility permanently. She never returned to Willow Creek. But Nora did. Every morning, raising the flag, watering her roses, smiling at the future she had defended, not with weapons but with will. The HOA was gone. But the community had finally arrived.